Hello, and welcome to the fifth of our video lecture series. This one is about energy and the ecosystem. And so this image here is kind of just our generic ecosystem and how energy flows through it. Important thing to note is that the direction of the arrows shows that that energy only flows one way. It can't reverse and go the opposite way. And something that we're going to show today is that the energy efficiency in an ecosystem is actually very low or very inefficient. And a lot of the energy that goes in is lost in the form of this unusable heat. So how does energy enter the ecosystem? It enters primarily through photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is what our producers do. And we've got a nice picture of some tropical plants in a rainforest here. All of these plants are undergoing a chemical reaction known as photosynthesis, where they're taking solar energy and using that energy to fix CO2, carbon dioxide, and H2O, water, into glucose. And this glucose molecule here is able to store energy. And it stores it in the chemical bonds within the molecule. And then we also have the waste product of oxygen created here. Something to note here with photosynthesis, the actual atoms themselves in these molecules is very important, and we'll be tracking how they move through the environment. So the carbon cycle plays a big role in photosynthesis. We need to have available CO2 in order for photosynthesis to happen. The water cycle is another important one here for the reaction of photosynthesis, and then some others we'll talk about later are nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus cycles. Cellular respiration, this is the exact opposite of the photosynthesis equation. And what I mean by opposite is it goes in the opposite direction. So here we're starting with glucose and we're using oxygen to break down glucose. And so this reaction happens in all cells, and it's kind of how that stored energy gets used. And so when we break the bonds between the carbon, the hydrogen, and the oxygen in glucose, we release energy. And in the cellular respiration equation, that energy is then stored in ATP. And ATP is a molecule that cells can use to actually do work, if you're talking about the physics side. You also get the waste products of water and carbon dioxide from cellular respiration. Those two things, again, are part of the carbon cycle and the water cycle, things that we'll look at later. Food chains and food webs. So these are two different things, although they are closely related. What I have here shown is a food web. These 4 organisms here would be part of an Arctic food web. They all live in the same area, and they get energy from one another. So at the very bottom, we've got our Arctic grasses. These are our primary producers. And they are the ones undergoing the photosynthesis. So this Arctic grass is taking energy from the sun. It's storing it as glucose, using some of that glucose to grow taller. But some of that glucose is stored within the organism itself, and you can have the lemming come and eat it. And that lemming would be our first consumer, and it's called a consumer because it is taking the energy and consuming it from the previous level here. And so the energy from the grasses that were stored in Arctic grasses can then be used, that glucose can be used by the lemming to store energy in its cells or to do work, to move around, to reproduce, to find shelter. And the food chain goes on. So the energy from the lemming gets transferred onto the fox when the fox eats the lemming, and the energy from the fox gets transferred onto the Arctic wolf when the wolf eats the fox. These different levels here, the fox and the wolf are also consumers. We would have a primary consumer for the lemming. This would be a secondary consumer, and we would have a tertiary consumer on the top here. And an important note here with food chains is that energy can only flow in one direction, right? It's an upward only flow of energy. The fox does not give any energy back to the lemming, or the lemmings cannot eat the fox. If they could, we would have the lemming above the fox. So the direction of the arrow is very important. Some people get confused and try to flip them and say, well, the wolf eats the fox, so that's why the arrow points that way. It's the direction that the energy flows in our food chain. A food web is much more complex. So this would be a more complete food web for the same Arctic ecosystem. And important thing here with the food web is we've got arrows kind of all over the place. Along the bottom here are our primary producers. These organisms are giving the energy to several different things. And if you look at our old friend, the Arctic grass here, we can see that the Arctic grass is not just eaten by lemmings, but the muskox, the pikas, the caribou, and even the brown bears themselves enjoy the energy from the Arctic grasses. And so each arrow here indicates energy transferred from one level to the next level. So our Arctic grass is giving energy to the caribou, which is also giving energy to the Arctic wolf. The Arctic grass goes to the muskox. Muskox is also giving energy when it gets eaten by the polar bear. And so that is a food web. And with this, all the energy interactions, or all the feeding interactions between the organisms are shown in this food web. Our next slide here is about trophic levels. And so trophic levels are the feeding levels of our different organisms. They're going to be measured in these numbers here, this 10,000 and 1,000, etc. Those are measured in kilocalories, which we abbreviate kcals. So at the bottom level here in our producers, we've got 10,000 kilocalories. And if you look at it, this is a pretty large box they have drawn, right? It extends all the way across here in width. It's a very wide box because these primary producers are fixing 10,000 kilocalories, which is a lot of kilocalories in this one. As we move up, our second level, the primary consumers, or the grasshopper, this box here is a much narrower box. And if you look at the number of kilocalories available, that's only 1,000. Something to note here, what goes on is at each energy level transformation, so as we go from producers to primary consumers, only 10% of that energy is remaining. And then as we go up again from primary to secondary, so as the grasshoppers are eaten by the birds, again, this is getting much narrower, and we only have 100 left. Again, 10%. So what we have in ecology here is what's called the rule of 10%. Rule of 10%. The rule of 10% says that at each energy level, or at each trophic level in an ecosystem, only 10% of the energy that was available before is available. And ecosystems are very efficient when it comes to energy transfers. That's why we have the 10% rule. The other 90% of the energy is lost as heat, and that heat cannot be used again, right? It's never gained back into the ecosystem. This is lost to the atmosphere in energy. This rule of 10% is why we have very few top-level consumers. Like this tertiary consumer here, our owl, there are much fewer owls than there are birds. And there are much fewer birds than there are grasshoppers, and much fewer grasshoppers than there are plants. And that's because there's less energy available for each of those levels as you go up, right? The owl only has, or is only getting 10 kilocalories of energy from all the birds that they're eating. So a very inefficient ecosystem leads to this numbers game where you end up with fewer owls on the top. We got 3 different types of ecological pyramids. The energy period I've kind of described before. This is the relative amount of energy available to each level. So as you go up, you lose 10% of the previous number, right? 100% originally with the producers, drops down to 10% with the first level consumers, another 10% off, and you're down to 1% for the secondary consumers, and so on and so forth. You also have a biomass pyramid, and biomass is just the amount of living organic matter at each trophic level. So if we found the mass of every one of these stalks of grain, or every one of the plants, or every one of the trees, right? So it's a pretty large mass. There are a lot of plants out there, and so that mass gets really high. The next level, let's say they're eaten by the chickens, the grain is eaten by the chickens. Again, we're going to find the mass of all those chickens, and it's going to be pretty large, but it's only going to be about 10% of the mass of the grains. And the human tissue that comes from eating the chicken, again, we're dropping down by about 10%. The numbers pyramid is going to look pretty similar. We have a lot more primary producers because they have more energy available to them. The primary consumers would be pretty numerous, but not as numerous as the producers are, because they rely on the energy from the primary producers. Net primary productivity. This is the last part of this slide here. Net primary productivity is the rate of how much energy producers can turn into biomass. And so we're going to measure that in carbon grams of carbon per square meter per day. And when we're talking net primary productivity, we're actually taking out respiration from it. So to grow and to live, those plants have to use some of the energy they capture from the sun. And so that glucose they're using goes to growing taller or keeping their systems running, pulling water up through their stalks. So for net primary productivity, we're taking out some of that energy. This graphic up here is kind of showing the different ecosystems or the different biomes on the left here, and we can see what percent of surface area they make up. So the ocean, open ocean, makes up an astronomical amount of Earth's surface compared to all the other biomes that we've got. But if you look at the average net primary productivity, open ocean is very, very weak. Right? There's not a lot of things that live in the open ocean. There's not a lot of photosynthesis going on. So if you compare that to the tropical rainforest, which has an awful lot of producers, a lot of green plants doing photosynthesis, you end up with a much higher net primary productivity. Some of the marine ecosystems that have high primary productivity are things that are shallower water and have a lot of plankton or aquatic plants growing up, like swamps and marshlands, or algae beds and coral reefs. So these are very high net primary productivity. So they are fixing a lot of carbon per square meter per day. Now, if you look at the percentage of Earth's net primary productivity, that would take the entire globe into effect. And so the open ocean makes up the most, right? Almost 25% of all the primary productivity in the world. And if you wonder how that could be, because their net is so small, it's because they take up such a large percentage. What's amazing is that the tropical rainforest, which makes up only 3% of the Earth's surface, ends up about equal to the open ocean in percentage of our net primary production. So I hope the video was helpful. Please have some notes prepared for class tomorrow, and we'll see you later.